On today's episode of Ethical Exits, we're trying something a little different. Instead of a traditional founder interview, my guest, Matthew Epperson, from the Georgia Center for Employee Ownership, brings me a real acquisition story that I've never heard before. No prep, no notes, just real-time reactions. We unpack the rise of true value hardware, how independent retailers built national scale without giving up ownership, why one cooperative chose private equity while others stayed independent, and what happened next. There are twists, there's also a bankruptcy, but there's also a cooperative comeback arc. And underneath all of it is a much bigger question. What kinds of ownership structures actually hold up under enormous pressure? This is the kind of conversation Ethical Exits was built for, because everybody understands hardware stores. Almost nobody understands cooperative ownership. And this story becomes an accessible gateway into much bigger ideas: private equity, community ownership, scale, survival, and what happens when mission-driven businesses collide with modern capital markets. If you care about employee ownership, ethical business, community wealth building, or the future of independent business in America, I think you're going to love this one. Matt certainly did an excellent job, and I want to do more of this. If you have an acquisition, exit, succession, or ownership transition story that you think that we should explore on the show and you'd like to help tell it, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at ethicalexits.com and say hi. I'm Hannah Sandmeyer, and this is Ethical Exits. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ethical Exits, the Everything M&A podcast for mission-driven businesses. I'm your host, Hannah Sandmeyer, and today's episode is a little bit different in the most exciting way. This will be a narrative episode, my favorite type of show, where we just get to explore a real life story of an exit or an acquisition together in real time. And today, my guest is Matthew Epperson. Matthew is the outreach coordinator for the Georgia Center for Employee Ownership and the Georgia Cooperative Development Center. Matt knows more about employee ownership than likely I ever will. He spent years working in employee ownership cooperatives and community wealth building, helping to support models that give more people a real stake in the businesses where they work. He's also, I'm very privileged to say that he is a longtime listener and supporter of Ethical Exits. Matthew's been following along. And he always has some sort of comment, most typically, which is great. And that makes this episode especially fun because today, instead of the traditional interview or me telling you a story, Matt is bringing me a story of a real life acquisition or ownership
It's a real
transition
privilege.
story. A real privilege, yes. And it may be a story that I have no context around. He certainly has not told me what he's about to share. We thought that would
This
be
is all
kind of
real,
fun.
folks.
This is a real life experience. So you're gonna get to hear my real life in real time reactions, questions, and thoughts unfold in real time alongside Matthew. And I hope that we'll make it super engaging for you. I'm a bit nervous. I think Matthew is even more nervous.
If I get close enough, you might see the sweat.
But this is the first time I have not prepped at all for for an episode of Ethical Exits. Matthew has done all the work, so
Many nights of prep have led to this moment. In defense of however this comes out.
Yeah, right. We'll see what that turns into, but I'm super excited. So, Matthew, without further ado, thank you and welcome to Ethical Exits. I'm super excited to see where this goes.
It's an honor, Hannah. Thank you. And it really is. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here. And call me a super fan. I think that's completely completely accurate. And yeah, I just, I've loved everything Ethical Exits, right? I mean, not that you asked for a plug, but just being, as you said, this kind of in this employee ownership space, right? Like we've been thinking about what is an ethical exit for decades, you might say centuries, right? So the fact that there is this platform where like you're regularly bringing these types of stories to the fore, and as you were kind of saying in the lead up to this, we're like there's so much like opaqueness to these stories. So it's actually like a really fun challenge for me to be given this provocation, like find an interesting story and bring it to Hannah. And true enough, Hannah has no idea what I'm about to say.
No idea.
The story today is True Value Hardware.
Oh, shit. Okay, cool. Excellent. I think, isn't a True Value hardware store in my area of like
Quite
Portland?
Possibly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Very
Yep.
good. Very good.
It's part of the market share. Yep. Yes. And yeah, to try to like tee this up a little bit, what is it that really drew me to this story? Well, I guess it's a few things you'll hear. There's definitely some twists and turns to it. There's been multiple, in fact, exits involved here, but there's two crucial exits that we'll talk about, two transactions. And I want to also kind of paint this in a broader picture too, of sort of this world of hardware retail, of the friendly place, the neighborhood hardware store, and kind of how that has changed over time, and how these these types of M&A deals have figured into how that story has changed over time, right? So,
oh, I'm so piqued. You have my interest so piqued.
Without further ado,
I had to say too, Matt, like Gina Schaefer, as you likely know, because you're a fan of the pod.
That's right.
She and I have become like best friends. I call her Blanket. Because whenever we're around each other, we're always around each other. So we were just at the National Center for Employee Ownership, and I was just speaking with her this morning. So I have some context around, like, of course, her story, and she shared how hardware stores Ace and what's the other one?
Do It
Ace,
Best. And
yes, Do It Best, how they kind of work and how their cooperative model is really unique. And her story and her journey, of course, transitioning into an ESOP, and she continues to grow that ESOP share for her company. And they continue to acquire companies, hardware stores, and open new hardware stores. So very excellent. Gina will be super excited. This is the story. I'm sure she'll listen.
Funny story, I gave her the lead before you. And sure enough, I had... I definitely had an AI hallucination because I gaffed a very important detail that Gina immediately corrected.
Very good.
Like, nope, not that one.
Very good.
I just saw her in Birmingham, actually, at the local legacy conference for the Alabama Center for Employee Ownership. So she was our keynote. And actually, funny enough, that was the first time I actually got to meet Gina face to face for the first time. So that's also part of just sort of the synchronicity of me wanting to raise my hand and tell this particular story. And
very cool.
And just to also, I don't know, connect it really quickly to my own personal story. So actually my entrance to this whole world of like co-ops and shared ownership was also through cooperative retail, but of a slightly different variety. I actually came through the natural foods grocery space, these natural food co-ops, right? So that's a space where there is this sort of shared ownership element, just in a different type of retail, know? So that's also where like I've been aware of this space for a while, but just hadn't made the deep dive into like, other than people like Gina knowing her story and Ace specifically, I didn't actually know very much about True Values. That's also like, there's been a lot of learning and downloading into my brain in the prep process for this. So, all right. To give y'all, to give you an episode thesis, I would say True Value is a story about how independent retailers built scale without surrendering ownership, and how that model was tested by big box retail, succession, private equity, and bankruptcy. So I want to start with what I'm kind of calling the emotional center, or John Cotter, who was a boy from St. Paul, Minnesota, who turned a hardware store job into a lifelong project to preserve independent dealer power. The episode ultimately argues that basically this fiercely independent hardware retail co-op movement is one proxy for the co-op movement itself. It's not a relic. It's just actually one of the most durable answers American businesses have ever produced for the problem of scaling both our operations as well as our purpose. So to kind of set us up here, behind every friendly neighborhood hardware store is a fight most people never see. A fight over who owns the supply chain, who captures the profit, and whether local retail can survive in a world built for giants. So taking a step back, I want to start again with John Cotter. So he was born on July 8th, 1904 in St. Paul, Minnesota. His father worked for the local streetcar company. His mother grew up on an Iowa farm and had worked as a maid in St. Paul prior to her marriage. At the age of 12, young John Cotter happened to be in a small hardware store near his home when he spotted a sum of money lying on a shelf. No one else was within sight, and it would have been easy for 12-year-old John to just take that money and not get caught. And instead, young John called the store owner's attention to the money. "You ought to put that in a safe place," he said. And Harold Chamberlain, the owner of that store, was impressed by this boy's honesty, and a few days later had hired John as a part-time job at the store. So I wanted to give you that framing as John as a person, first of all, is to say that it's a different world, right? I'm taking you back into the turn of the century, early 1900s, and, this was just the world as it was at the time, right? So it's sort of, but it's also setting up his character as a person who was motivated, honest, wanted to make good in the world, right? So after, getting this job, and he actually kind of worked his way up in the hardware store space, right? So he did things like, as you might imagine, he was sweeping floors, he was cutting glass at the time, threading pipe, I guess, was like a regular activity you would do if you worked in hardware retail. So he learned his store from the floor up, right? He finished high school, he started working for other wholesalers, and then actually came into operating his own store in his early 20s. So he's very much showing like sort of an entrepreneurial trend that would, really serve him throughout his life and ultimately make him sort of an instrumental figure also in this story overall. But he decided to become a traveling salesman, actually. So he actually took up the job for a traveling wholesale company selling hardware products. And so that's how he actually got a national view of how the business worked, right? Of how these mom and pop hardware stores weren't just where he was in Minnesota, right? It was like all over the country, right? The people, they're always having to fix stuff for various reasons. They need these types of goods and services. And ultimately, he was also finding with this exposure that there was a little bit of a friction here, right? So the average retailer he was traveling to as a traveling salesman was kind of getting raked over the coals by wholesalers. So this was kind of the trade environment of the time, was just realizing that it was very hard to be an independent retailer. And it's always been that case, as it turns out.
Right.
That was true then, still true now in some ways. But to say that, this business model where there's a wholesaler who sits between you and whomever actually produces the goods you're selling in your retail operation, and that they could basically sort of, have their way and basically charge what they want and have these kind of like exorbitant prices, right? This bloated middle entity, bloated middleman. I realized I'd never heard the term jobby before, but I guess jobbies was a term for these like middlemen who, jack up prices and ultimately, squeeze both sides, the people who like make the stuff as well as, ultimately the customer on the other side. So his, insight, he realized, was not only that, there was a business problem here, that wholesalers had too much power, right? They were charging too much for their goods and services. But so like one of the sort of consequences of that is that, the independent retailer also then is charging more, and it's just harder to compete. So he had also noticed that when he was traveling around, basically almost every time without fail, whenever he showed up at a hardware store that was a part of some kind of a cooperative, he just noticed like these are always the best stores. And he didn't really quite know why that was, that like they were busy. They, were clearly like sort of functional hubs of their communities, but he eventually kind of figured it out, right? And he was like starting to speak to more of these business owners because he was already doing business with them anyway, and just kind of curious, just a curious person, like what is it that makes this co-op structure different from the other structures? And then so he kind of downloaded for himself this idea that, when the retailer actually owns the wholesaler, they actually sort of change structurally, the incentive.
Yes, exactly.
To not do what was already happening, right? There's a chance to actually just sort of operate at cost and lower the price, because you have this shared ownership element of like you own the wholesaler. In fact, you sort of become the wholesaler. And this is something that we've been doing in lots of other industries too. It's really common in agriculture. It's happening in, well, not at this point yet, but it would be happening in electricity shortly after this with rural electrification. So it's kind of a trend in, the US that we've kind of figured this out in a couple of different places, but it was kind of like a revelation for him,
And in that sense, like this kind of cooperative where they own the wholesaler, they can control the pricing, they can certainly control the dynamics a little bit. That is almost like a community ownership model. But the business, the cooperative, is the community. And so they're working more and they're making decisions. Their incentives are aligned to make decisions that are good for the whole, rather than, and I, maybe it's not fair, but I think of like this jobby. I'm going to start using that, Matt. I think about this jobby as, this, of course, as they are an intermediary, but they're like fiercely independent and maybe also so self-interested, right? Because they can kind of control prices, they can control the margin, they kind of, because they don't, well, and I hesitate to say it this way too, but I think it's flatly fair. Like they're taking the value that's created by somebody else, the person who makes these products, manufactures these products of value,
Right.
they take them and then they control this space where they can leverage that arbitrage moment. And they're kind of in control of what that arbitrage moment looks like. So by that, I mean, of course, the profit and loss that they make,
Right.
and the prices that they control. And that's more about a self-interested, like, kind of a zero-sum capitalism game that
Right.
we're playing. And I'll just say this very quickly, we're starting to see this in AI and how China is deploying AI versus how we're deploying AI in the United States, where AI is deployed more for like the person, the individual, the company to gain more market share.
Right.
Everybody else be damned. It's kind of like, I have more AI, I have more AI or more AI intelligence than you do, so therefore I win,
Right.
or I gain more market share. Whereas China, for good or for bad, is deploying AI more one to many. So how do we leverage this thing to benefit the whole? So placing AI intelligence in, like, for instance, like the energy economy. How do we make energy? How do we distribute energy more effectively, more efficiently, versus why I'm using it to empower myself and to get more power? Am I following
Yeah.
correctly as kind of how that kind of works? So this
Yeah.
cooperative model is kind of working like a community.
Right.
So then their incentives are totally different than if they're working more of a, this is about independence and competitiveness with everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I totally hear where the question is kind of coming from. Where like it's just almost sort of this binary of like, yeah, one to one or
Yes.
one to many.
Yes.
And I feel that, the interesting thing about like the cooperative movement is it's always trying to occupy this interesting like third space, right? So it's trying to take the best of both worlds in many different respects, and so what I mean by that is like there is definitely this idea of sort of like rugged individualism and rugged capitalism.
Yes.
About a story like a James Cotter, for example, who very much identified with this idea of like, the shrewd businessman, is a constant cost cutter, and would find, ruthlessly seek efficiencies in a way that would be very familiar to us in the strictly for-profit, investor-owned firm context.
Yes.
And at the same time, he was also aware that, like, yes, there was potentially a greater economic upside that could be built into, these more just like investor-owned models of what would eventually become the big box store. There is at times more money to be made that way, but it ends up being this like trade-off in time scale, right? Of like, he just said, we need a longer time scale to be thinking about this. And when we do that, the math actually maths properly when we spread out risk and we spread out benefit. It's like, that's where the cooperative idea was so seductive for him, I think. And it like really brought him into it. It's like, we need to share ownership across all of these retailers who each themselves were James Cotters in a sense in his mind, of like, because the owners of the cooperative are individual retail operation owners, dealers, as they call them, retail owners. They're the heroes also of his story, right? Of like, it starts with maybe like a James Cotter, but then it also becomes hundreds, thousands of retail store owners who are also owners. And so their incentive, their motivation comes back to ownership and control and actually brings in this piece of democracy, right? Of like the vote, so the vote ends up becoming a big part of the story because, it ends up becoming this huge governance question when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. What do the members say? Do they approve when we come to a point of should we sell, should we merge, should we acquire? And so that's actually, kind of how the story evolves over time, right? So they're kind of moving into, so in this point of the story, we're in 1947. Yeah. This is when John really gets the idea that ultimately would become what was at the time called Cotter and Company and would eventually become True Value Hardware, right? So Cotter with his co-founder, Ed, mailed a proposal to 2,000 retailers. So you just imagine him in a phone book and his partner, getting addresses and writing off notes saying, hey, I'm trying to make this co-op thing happen. You're an independent hardware retailer. Let's be stronger together. Let's do something. And in order to do that, I need your earnest money. And that earnest money is $1,500. Okay. I didn't do the math.
That's a lot of money.
In today's dollars. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So it definitely was this, this sort of flashpoint, and I guess you'd say, or like, I actually called it a Hail Mary in my notes, because he was like, I'm just sending off letters to 2,000 people who I've never met. And I'm saying, would you give me $1,500 and let's make a co-op?
Jeez. Yeah.
And so this is the scary moment. And so he ended up getting 10% responded. So that would be 200 of those folks responded.
Amazing.
10 of them showed up to the pre-organizational meeting. and then 4 of them went into diligence with him.
Wow. 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 That sounds like most people's pipelines today, actually.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he had to keep working, keep grinding, right? So he actually got 25 members though before the end of 1947. So this was actually the kickoff. This is what created the infrastructure that would become True Value. So to kind of bring us forward a little bit in the story, the acquisition. So there's a few different sort of acquisitions that occurred here, but one of them was crucial a little bit later in the 60s was of a company, and I'm realizing now that my notes did not capture the name properly. Yes, it was okay. It was called Hibbard, Spencer, Bartlett and Company. So John acquires the trademark for $2,500 as part of a broader deal with Hibbard, Spencer, Bartlett and Company, and it becomes one of the most recognizable names in American hardware. That name being True Value.
Okay.
So this was the registered trademark of that company. And so this was part of, John's sort of entrepreneurial spirit and also like the vision that he had for the future was that he understood that a lot of the value he was driving could be summed up in his brand, right? So, before maybe that we quite understood the value of, the goodwill value, the logo, the brand concept, he was very much like a forerunner of that concept. Like he knew, like when he'd heard it, he'd seen it in the market, True Value, just like that name was going to have a major meaning for him, in his company.
And that it rather than having these fragmented company names or family names attached to stores, that he could leverage and borrow and grow and scale trust through a central brand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gave this national identity. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Okay. And this like familiarity, like something that people could latch onto and customers could recognize from city to city as they're traveling around or moving about the country. As jobs were taking them elsewhere, they had they had home improvement projects in new cities. If there was a True Value, then they kind of knew the quality of that store. So we started in the 20s, right? When we had 4 of these cooperatives, right, that John had gone out and got out of 2,000 letters.
Yeah.
He scaled to 25 within that first year, which is great. So he was able to leverage that moment to 5x. And then 20 years later, he partners with this larger firm. So where are we as far as like store numbers at this point, Matthew?
Yes. So great question. So over 1,000 stores at this point.
Shit. Okay, huge.
So huge growth.
And to understand too, to break down this model, so what this means is they now have a national brand. They own the wholesalers, or they have direct relationships with the manufacturers of like tools and supplies. So True Value is the brand. Right, is the parent company. Their agents that are representing the entire cooperative are negotiating with the suppliers on behalf of the cooperative to get the price that they need, that they want or need, that benefits both the manufacturer and the cooperative to be able to supply their stores, the 1,000 stores, with products and supplies that these stores need and that their customers need as well at a price point that they can afford where they still make money.
Exactly. Yep. And this is really also where sort of part of the differentiation that was occurring was also toward more like vertical integration as well, right? So this is around the time that like it was, of course, it was never just retail, but like now it's become much more like a viable business venture to move into the actual manufacturing space. So it's one of the things that James and others in that sort of hardware co-op space had realized was that like there's also major efficiencies upstream that we could be realizing on behalf of our members. So one of those, like I just mentioned, was, paint manufacturer. They were like, this still is a place where like we're spending way too much on this. We know from doing our diligence, we could just do it better ourselves. And you could kind of see that like that's a lot of the logic that happens here. This kind of innovation that comes out of this space is folks realizing like, hey, this is a problem. Collectively, let's do something about it. So we will actually go in and actually build our first ever paint facility within the True Value brand. And of course, as you could also see and imagine, right? So that because there was a sort of, at the time, there was really like a family of hardware cooperatives. There's much fewer of them today, but it's maybe upwards of a dozen at one point in U.S. history. That like they all look at each other, right? They're noticing like, oh, True Value did what? I think I'm going to go make some paint now too. And they moved into logistics. They've got their own fleet now. What if we had trucks?
Right.
And so the logistics game, the manufacturing, all of these become, like vertical integration innovations that grow rapidly in this space and end up setting the tone for the industry in many ways.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So that's kind of in very broad strokes, kind of like how we would maybe characterize the period that we might call even the golden age of sort of retail hardware in the US, right? So from sort of, coming post-Depression, post-World War II, moving into the 60s, 70s, 80s, things are still going really, really well. Growth year over year is still phenomenal. The number, the sales, the number of members, basically every metric, everything's going well for hardware, and specifically within this segment, right, which we're kind of just broadly thinking of like independent hardware retail, things are going well. Well, let's jump to the 90s. Welcome back. Things were not so good at this point. Now we come to the point where in the story just of James Cotter's life with Cotter & Co., and becoming more of the True Value brand, and now as a sort of national presence, they're getting major ad deals with, the National Football League and all sorts of ways to be prominent in American culture. Well, John has literally passed, right? So it's in the 90s. He was himself in his 90s, in the 90s. Yeah. He passes away, and his sons, Dan and Michael, and son-in-law, Paul, become new sort of CEO and executive management team of the True Value story. Yep.
Yeah.
So family transition, exactly. So they're preserving continuity, but they're also more so centralizing control. And it carried both this elements of the family business culture. So that's how you saw that in the succession strategy, but of course the cooperative ideals as well too. So we also have all these retailers who own us, but then we also simultaneously have this like family structure at the same time, right? And yeah, so that's kind of how it went for John. That's kind of how he would stay that way. And by this point, right, so what we're really starting to deal with is the big box. So this has historically not yet become the thing, or the sort of overwhelming thing anyway. This is still newer to the scene, this idea of the Home Depot and the Lowe's, right? Those actually hadn't yet really come to their full prominence until kind of the 90s, if you can believe that. Going back in time, I think for many of us who now are like, well, they were always that way. Well, it wasn't always that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and the square footage of these neighborhood hardware stores still to this day are like a fraction. I mean, when we say big box, of course, we were talking about a lot of different things, but just even the size of the stores, and then the size of the tickets, and then of course the number of products that are carried, and the turnover and the variety of different products in each type of category. I think Gina still says, like even today in her hardware stores, the average ticket is like $20. It's
right.
There's still like a lack of parking for most of these hardware stores. People are walking to them and carrying out, like legit carrying out what they buy, right? Where the big box, much bigger tickets, much bigger store, much bigger parking lot. The emphasis is more on buying large quantities of bigger, more expensive items.
The problem isn't intent, it's infrastructure. They all want better outcomes, they just can't find each other in time. In traditional deal flow, processes are competitive and price becomes the only signal that matters. So we built something different, a place where buyers, sellers, and partners can share what really matters, where what matters is visible: stewardship, certification, values, identity, intent, and goals, and find each other earlier, before outcomes are decided, where you can search for alignment, not just listings, and where the model itself is different. No commissions, no incentives to push deals that don't fit, but a real opportunity to give back, so that when great outcomes happen, they can fund what comes next. Because when the right people find each other earlier and more consistently, everything changes. Better outcomes by design. Steward Market.
Right. Exactly. And so this is where like starts to get to be like the differentiation, I think, in the sort of the American consciousness about like, when do I go to which type of store to get my hardware needs met? Becomes one of, where like, yeah, if I've got a fair amount of lead time and like, oh, I'm trying to like maybe, remodel my house. It's something much more like proactive, that it feels like, oh, well, maybe price is the biggest thing for me. So I just need to go cheap. I'm probably going to go to one of the bigger stores. But for the things that actually like make my life run, the things that are much more urgent, I just sprung a leak. This sink, this whatever, the urgency of our lives, in many ways becomes, and so the interesting piece of that, right, is that with that average $20 basket that Gina was referencing, the interesting sort of upside to the co-op movement is that they also become even further sort of closer, I would say, to the consumer, because we get to be this bifurcation, right, of like, okay, so for the people that I really, really trust with like the things that I have to fix in a timely way, I go to the co-op for that. I go to Ace, I go to True Value, I go to Do It Best. But for the other stuff, I'm not as concerned. And so loyalty is definitely an issue, because folks are doing both. Most people aren't necessarily saying like, oh, I'm exclusively this, I'm exclusively that,
Sure. Right.
But yeah, that's kind of bifurcation. So I made a little handy graph for myself using AI, where I just asked it to like map market share between, big format and small format hardware retail in the US. And it's right here at about 95 that those cross over each other. Majority market share shifts from the independents to the big box. And it happens right in the mid 90s.
Shit. Okay, so they get crushed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not entirely, so that even, looking at so this particular graph only goes up to 2025. If you combine big box and independent small format, you're still only landing at about 75% market share for hardware sales. The delta, of course, being e-commerce, right? So that's more like your Amazon filling in.
Okay. Because they're also a player in this, where it's not just Lowe's and Home Depot.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that kind of tease us up a little bit for, the first kind of major M&A shift in this space for True Value. And that's so True Value is now going to drastically shift itself. And the way that that's going to happen is with private equity. So Acon Investments ends up stepping into this story by basically like offering to purchase a considerable portion. In fact, 70% of the company is now on the table. Ultimately, of course, a lot of this is behind closed doors, but then they ultimately land after negotiations. And then, so the board of directors really are the ones so True Value's board are the ones who initially kind of field the inquiry from Acon Investments. And they give unanimous recommendation to approve. So this goes to a member vote. And the members say, let's do it. So it was not unanimous. So it was 83%. So, still a healthy margin though, right? Like that definitely shows that like this co-op thought this was a good idea.
Okay. And let's step back there because I want to make sure I understand like who is the co-op, who has voting rights in this scenario. So I imagine it's not all the employees
Correct.
of all these Ace hardwares all over the country, which I imagine now
True Values,
True Value are thousands of employees across the country. These are just the owners of those stores, the cooperative member owners, which are the leads or whoever owns that hardware store locally.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
And so they have representatives though in their board of directors, and I think their board was maybe 5 individuals. So, but they are themselves, per their bylaws, every one of those board directors has to be a member of True Value. So each one of them is also a store owner. Could be multiple locations, but yeah, at least one member retail business within the cooperative.
Okay.
Yep.
And they all vote yes, because this offers, and they're looking for cash to infuse into the business to try to become more competitive.
Exactly.
With these big, okay.
Yes. So they're noticing, that there's something going on, right? We are seeing these big boxes spring up in more and more of our markets, and we're scared. And we're also further seeing that, they had their own particular sort of challenges that I think were somewhat unique to True Value, but also were systemic as well. So they had some of their own, they ended up having to realize a fairly large accounting error, unfortunately.
True.
Once, this deal had gone through back in the 90s, actually. So there had been some damages back then. And so there'd been a little bit of a chip on their shoulder of like, oh, we're a little bit wounded by this. And they'd lost some members. They'd lost some faith. They'd lost some trust back with the merger in the 90s. but to your point, it absolutely was seeking like greater scale, efficiency, logistics, right? Of like, we need to invest more in on-time delivery, no missed picks on our orders.
Oh, you had to compete against e-commerce too, right?
Exactly.
Because convenience was getting like it was becoming more and more popular. People were demanding a higher level of customer service or just faster customer service, and that's a different model that they never had to really compete against. The
Right.
e-commerce model, where you don't have to go anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's there.
That
Exactly.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say between macro and micro shifts, there was like lots of reasons that were kind of prompting the board of directors to unanimously say like, we recommend this to you all of our individual True Hardware members, all the thousands of y'all who actually make the final call, because this is still going to be decided ultimately by the members. We recommend it, and then the members then took that decision by the board and then more or less ratified it, right? And they were like, yes, we also agree with you, board of directors. At least 83% of us said yes. So
wow,
strong majority of their folks did this. And I will say that it also came with some narrative shift. Okay. And so this is and just to extend sort of where we are. So we've actually at this point we've come forward in the story. So I didn't make that really clear. So when the ACON is coming into the picture, this is now getting towards circa 2018. So we've actually moved forward a little bit, right, since the 90s. And the struggle has been real through that time period, right? So we've been seeing some losses. We're losing market share system-wide. And that's also part of why, like in 2018, the reality of the big box is so solid. E-commerce is such a threat, and we need this infusion of capital to do distribution, to do logistics in ways that we've never had to before. So
yeah, and I think the other component that comes to mind, especially in this time period, and competing against companies like Amazon and these other e-commerce players, and Walmart, and even maybe Target, that has more of a wider footprint. This isn't a fair fight, Matthew. I mean, these companies are very well VC backed, right? Or they're publicly owned, right? So the amount of capital they have access to is it's like a David versus Goliath situation.
Exactly.
They're never going to catch up. It's just going to be diminishing returns if they continue to stay independent and don't really consider an offer like this, an outside offer from a private equity company. So I can see why they would feel like maybe that they had really no choice, and that's why why a super majority of 83% or whatever you said it was fell in line, because it's like, well, we don't see any other way where we can continue to put this train on the tracks and continue to generate revenue where we can maintain what we really care about, right? Which is, I imagine, the mission and like what people really were thinking about, why they were in business in the first place, to continue servicing that entity. There's just really no way for them to continue business as usual in this brand new net bizarro world of free flow and cash. I mean, I remember these days, like everybody was going IPO too, right? So the amount of capital that was going into companies was just like outrageous, right?
Yep, absolutely. And so what's so interesting, is like how that moved toward like the IPO and the free flowing cash, and like seeing how these capital markets were changing and how that would interact with this sort of like decentralized cooperative ownership model. So I found this particular quote really fascinating. So at the time, then CEO John Hartman of True Value said, "I have very strong respect for the history of the co-op model, whether it is the True Value flag or any other co-op. I understand why the co-op model existed, but in 2018, the concept of locking in an independent retailer's equity into a company is in such a way that they can't touch it or make the most logical use of that money to invest in their own business is an outdated model." So the narrative has shifted in a big, big way by this point.
Now, who's this guy? Is he family? Is he still part of the familiar ownership, or those folks have gone away now? Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Great point.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly. So that's where, so his background is more so in this world. So he's coming from a world that is more used to exactly what you were pointing to, right? This world of the free flowing capital markets. That's more so when like he's just thinking about it. And so like when he looks at and like so sort of through his framing of like looking at that co-op model, all he sees is just trapped equity.
Right. He's like, that's cute. Time to be real business people now.
Exactly. And I've got some buddies and we're going to make this work.
So that's another kind of an important distinction, and so for our listeners that may not be like hyper familiar with cooperatives, and totally, like it's totally fair. Like this isn't like a conversation that we have every day or that we read about in the newspaper,
Right.
but this idea of how equity is shared. So Matt, can you kind of explain how the equity is moving and how profits were being shared throughout the cooperative at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. And yeah, so this kind of harkens back to earlier in the story when I was kind of mentioning
Yeah,
like, John sending out letters to 2,000 folks asking for
yeah,
$1,500. So
yeah.
what
The
he was
earnest money.
asking for that, yeah, was an equity investment, right? So
Hmm.
he's asking these retailers to say, give me money to put on this balance sheet. And in
Hmm.
exchange for that, you're going to become an owner, right? So that's a
Hmm.
fairly familiar kind of transaction, right? So we're buying,
Hmm.
a dividend upside potentially from profitability. There will be a
Hmm.
dividend profit share. But also, what's interesting is that, in this context, it's actually called typically a rebate. And the reason that they use the word of a rebate, they might say a patronage rebate or a patronage refund, is actually because it's based upon how much they buy through their cooperative. So this is the sense of being
Oh,
like a purchasing co-op. The more that you buy
oh,
through the co-op, the more of a rebate you get back. So a lot of the
oh,
value that's been revolved over time since the founding of these earlier, hardware co-ops has been coming back to their patronage, right? Their usage of the cooperative. So
I
that's
see.
that's a key piece of like what co-op equity means. And yes, you can actually unlock it in the sense of like people are actually free to choose to like, hey, I'm going to leave this co-op.
Mm,
That would then trigger like, okay, well then we need to return your equity, whatever amount it
mm,
was. Certainly not 1,500 at this point.
right.
you know,
You're right.
the buy-in
Whatever that
amount.
shares. Yeah,
Yeah,
whatever the
exactly.
shares are worth at that point. Hmm.
You'll get, maybe they'll spread it out a little bit over like 5 years or more, but they will pay that equity back, and
Hmm.
then some, right? Because there's actually been a piece where it's actually been retained on the balance sheet of the co-op in your name as a member of that
Mm,
co-op, because they don't just give it all back. They say like we're actually going
mm,
to split some of it. Some of it will be in cash. Some of it will be retained.
mm,
So that's where
mm,
like there is this kind of built-in loyalty element to the equity of a cooperative, is that they're actually
mm,
building that balance sheet based on how much you use the co-op. So it becomes
hmm.
this incentive to do
Mm,
so, right?
hmm. So I think of that as like a member of REI.
Yep.
Maybe a lot of our listeners like are familiar with that,
Yeah,
where you get your
exactly.
annual rebate from REI as a consumer, right?
Yep.
So I know their cooperative model is a little bit different than what we're talking about here, but the concept is the same. So
Yep.
the more I'm buying from the cooperative, the more materials I'm buying. And Gina shared like, with her store, there was a set number of products that you had to have, and you bought that from the cooperative, right?
Right.
And then whatever extra square footage you had, you can use for whatever you want, right? So you could have distinct mixes in your stores of different products and services based on what you felt like the need was or where the demand was in your neighborhood, wherever that store was. Okay, so that's very interesting. So now this outside operator who has no family lineage, and didn't grow up with the founder in the 1920s,
Yeah.
where he didn't travel around and experience all the jobbies and see this disconnect between cooperative owned stores versus
More
independents and that
traditional, right?
relationship between, yeah, with the wholesalers. So he's disconnected from that history. He's very much uh, a person of the 2010s,
Johnny
really,
come lately.
of our Johnny come lately. So Johnny come lately is like, yeah, that's cute the way you guys been doing that. I can see why you were doing that, but that's not how we compete in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's interesting, right? Because it's not right, because I was kind of saying like there is still this plurality of others. So what it wasn't just like it hadn't come to a point where it was like, okay, there was the big boxes and then there was True Value. It was still
Mm,
True Value, Do It Best, Orgill, Ace, like they were all
mm,
there, and so they were all kind of
mm,
looking at some of the same environment, but didn't all come to the same conclusion. Right? So in many
mm,
ways, I think there was this kind of like maybe voyeurism is too strong of a way to say it, but this
mm,
like curiosity from the other purchasing co-ops to be like,
mm,
huh, how's that going to work? you know,
mm.
we're not
You go first.
necessarily, yeah, exactly. We're not so sure, but that is interesting and we're glad you're doing it in a certain sense. you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
because if those promises had come true and then like that really was supposed to be like the answer for the hardware retail cooperatives, right? It's like, oh, let's all take on some kind of private equity.
Hmm.
um
And when they took that money and they bought 75% of the company, then 75% of the equity then goes to this one entity to repay the debt or whatever terms of their ownership structure.
Right.
So only 25% then is still maintained in the existing profit share model.
Exactly. Yeah. So it became this like so it was a 70-30 split going forward.
70-30.
Uh-huh. And the way that they revolved that, I think I actually have the numbers right here. Okay. So based on that, 70% of invested capital, 100% of promissory notes would be paid, and the 2017 patronage dividend, that's their portion of profits, would be repaid following close. This represents approximately $229 million in returns and credits to current True Value retailers. So the 4,400 member owners of True Value at the time got a payout of $229 million for that 70% ownership stake that they were then ceding to Acon Investments.
Okay.
You didn't start your business just to sell something. You started it to solve something. But solving big problems with limited resources, it's slow, it's hard. And in a market moving this fast, values need more than vision. They need velocity. This is the kind of challenge Up and Over Advisors was born to solve. We help mission-driven companies scale smarter through values-amplifying acquisitions. Because when ethical founders grow, capitalism gets an upgrade. We do the heavy lifting to find and qualify companies ready to partner or sell to someone like you. We don't just close deals, we open doors to broader impact. Ready to scale yours? Let's build the future on purpose. Visit upandoveradvisors.com to learn more.
So then, okay, to pick up there of sort of like, okay, so we've gone through this deal. Most of the members said yes, they got their payout, they gave up 70% of their ownership stake. Most of them agreed and said, okay, we see this as prudent, rational, let's do it. And now, the other co-ops are kind of waiting and finding out like, okay, did that work? And the members really, I suppose, like the members themselves were actually probably the most like, hey, is this really going to work?
Right.
And sort of is the answer, right? So we do see some like initial turnaround on some things, right? So at this point, I think they had a network of, I want to say 12 distribution centers around the United States. At least 2 of them were like loss leaders for the network. So they were able to kind of turn some of those around, turn their distribution centers into profit centers. Major overhead, as you might imagine, like a lot of this investment money was tailored to technological, advancement in the sense of like point of sale and, just all these different pieces of technology, right? That would be necessary to continue to operate at this scale, right? Of this kind of scale of an entity. And so what comes next really is, some promising results, but then from there, what happens in 2020? COVID.
Right. Knock,
knock. Knock, knock. So we're still kind of early into this moment, right? Of like this newly private equity infused and empowered. Maybe it's supercharged, maybe it's not. We're not sure. True Value coming into the pandemic. Well, hardware did well, So as one of the things that happened for COVID, right, is that like a lot of us, we were looking around for stuff to do. What is that fix-it project? What is that DIY thing? Maybe I should be a plant dad. Succulents are taking off.
Succulents had a huge moment. Yes.
Yeah. And who's going to provide that, right? When you're looking around, you're starting to think a little bit more creatively, maybe because of this pandemic moment. You're like, oh yeah, there is that local hardware maybe I haven't been to before. So it's a good moment, right? So across the system, they're finding that like sales have again gone back to the right direction, right? So we're seeing market share returning a little bit enough, that we're feeling a little bit more bullish about like, okay, we're in the right, we're doing something right to like harness the power of this COVID moment to grow our sales. And at the same time, for True Value, at least, it doesn't last, right? So they find that like 21, 22, 23, there was a spike and then the dip came back of like, oh, actually, we are still losing ground. And with it also came this, realization that, okay, we made a big gamble and it's really not paying off. So almost seemingly out of the blue, in October of 2024, what happens? Chapter 11.
Ah, shit. Yeah.
The big collapse of True Value comes. So the Acon era experiment did not stabilize the business long term. True Value enters bankruptcy and ultimately has a stalking horse bid to try to save some of what we can, right? So we've got an investment bank involved. They're actively searching for suitors. So we get this trailing horse bid. It's a viable bid, and should we now reveal who it is?
Oh God! Oh no! Please don't tell me. I think I know, but go ahead, Matt.
Do it best. The cooperative movement is coming back.
Yes.
To try to save the day.
To try to save the day, and they probably get the business at a discount.
Exactly.
Right? Because they're in trouble. So going back to this private equity investment, I'm curious, what structure did they use, Matt? Was it a leverage buyout? Did they borrow this money that they effectively paid by taking out a loan in the name of True Value to buy the business?
That is my understanding. So they did. So it's interesting, a piece of the story, and I was trying to do some little bit more digging onto this. So they did not reveal who the limited partners would be.
I see.
But they did attract, other private equity investors as limited partners in order to fund the $219 million that ultimately bought out the 70%.
Yeah, because that's typically how PE works. Not all the time, right? But typically, it's they borrow the money, so they don't there's a very limited portion. Maybe it's 20% that actually comes from the LPs or from the fund.
Right.
80% comes from leveraged debt that they take out in the name of the company. But they also have their 2 and 20 model, where regardless of how the business does, they still make 2%. Of their fee structure, and then they get 20%. This is standard model. It's not always, preface it that way. I guess there could be different ways to do this for sure. I know other private equity companies do this differently, but typically, if there is any profit, if there is any ROI from their investment, they take a 20% commission on any profits. So when they had this, they were able to survive through COVID, but this wasn't just true for small neighborhood stores, hardware stores people were going to. People were also still going to the big box or doing a ton of ordering on Amazon. So while it looked like they were, surviving, they still, as you said, they weren't keeping pace. They were still losing meaningful market share to their competitors. And at some point, they can't pay back their debts, right? And they not only does the experiment not work, does it not help them, it actually pushes them into bankruptcy, where now they're looking for another suitor, and it happens to be one of those folks who are waiting on the sideline drinking tea as they waited to see what happened. And they were able to hold on. So Do It Best was able to hold on with their original cooperative model. Made it through all these different ups and downs in market. I mean, my guess would be because they didn't have the pressure of an additional loan that they had to pay off at probably pretty high rates, as we've seen inflation and the rate environment kind of go nutty. I mean, it was maybe it worked in their favor during that time, but still, on that amount of money, any rate of interest is going to be crushing for a business as far as monthly liabilities.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think it's interesting because I was looking at sort of some of the comparisons of in this period of distress, how did this sector sort of try to absorb and or adapt to this particular moment? And when you looked at Do It Best and Ace and True Value, I think that one of the key differentiators, at least I was able to uncover, was that for them, for Do It Best and for Ace in particular, their survival strategy came back so much to their sort of identity as the helpful place, right? And so what they really were choosing to invest in during that time period was actually sort of beefing up their customer service rather than focusing so much on the distribution model, right? Of how many distribution centers and how quickly do we fill orders, and that stuff is very important, of course. But I think that for them to beef up how it is we solve problems on the day-to-day is actually the differentiator, and how it is that they really came through this moment actually stronger and able to be in a position, where they're okay, True Value, we'll make an offer, because they and so the CEO of Do It Best was very clear about what he saw in terms of these assets, right? So he was I see inventory and I see brand. That's what I'm seeing. And that's why they made this offer. So just to cut to that chase, 153 million in cash with about a 45 million in addition for contracts and other obligations.
Holy shit. So a lot less than they got in 2018.
Right.
Oh my. Okay. So that was really devastating. That was quite the haircut. I think that's fascinating. Now, do these True Value stores, do they own the real estate too, Matthew?
Some cases, yes. Some cases, no.
Okay.
Yeah. It's definitely a mixed bag.
Those are also great assets, right? When you're looking at an acquisition strategy, the assets there and the real estate can be a really strong because of, there's always ups and downs, but it's fairly dependable, right? To at least keep up with the rate of inflation. Okay, so fascinating. So I want to double tap on this because I think this is really interesting and really meaningful. So instead of looking at this moment of tremendous disruption, I mean, a global pandemic, right? Where people were dying, in the hundreds and the millions all around the world. We weren't sure how it was going to end. It required a medical and scientific miracle. Thank you to all the scientists and doctors and physicians who kept working. My God. I remember when I got my COVID shot, and I cried. Like the first one, I was just crying, it was like these people are, full scrubs, all the masks, all the stuff, and they're there to help us, it was just like such a meaningful, human moment. So Do It Best, ACE, these other cooperatives that didn't take the PE money, they doubled down in what do we do best? Let's spend money there. Let's increase customer service, increase our relationship with our consumers, increase our customer retention. Let's work on perhaps employee engagement as well, supporting our employees and staff through this just really scary time, especially to be working in retail. Remember when people were in bags over their head and stuff before we had masks, we didn't know it was transferred. All the people that showed up and allowed us to continue to have nice things, and kept doors open and kept access to food and other resources, so valuable. Whereas True Value in this moment, based on the PE infusion, they were trying to learn new things that they had never done before or that they were behind on. And that takes a huge infusion of cash to tackle these larger distribution, growth, scale objectives that might take a long time to receive to see that return on their investment. So much larger, lower margins, more of a long-term time horizon, but contradictorily working with money that has a very short-term horizon, right? So traditional PE models, their time horizon for exit or some sort of liquidity event can be as low as 5 years, right? Maybe on the higher end, 10 years, right? So they're working on these investments that are super expensive, are really hard, to make ends meet on, and to compete against these larger companies that have more money and maybe more runway, doing it with capital that isn't as patient, versus these other models who are
patient by design.
Patient by design, and just stay open. We're not looking for aggressive growth. We're just looking to kind of make it through in these really challenging times and doubling down on what we do best. I mean, what an important, valuable lesson of how to maybe look at opportunity, right? In a moment of extreme uncertainty.
Absolutely. Right. And to come back to fundamentals in some ways, right? That, I think it's, I guess I would only just want to sort of asterisks, slightly nuance, right? To say that okay, we would do the retail cooperative model the way that we did it in James Cotter's time. That wouldn't make sense, right? That would suggest okay, there's an outdated model here that it's resisting innovation, it's resisting agility. It's just this inert old thing, that is this retail hardware cooperative model. But I think that's not actually the case. And I think there's something so fascinating about the distributed ownership piece of the cooperative that actually really drives innovation, that ultimately the short-termist kind of profit-seeking capital ultimately ends up emulating is that it gets to be things like the garden center. How wild is that to suggest? But no one had really thought of the garden center before, of let's just do that as a part of a neighborhood retail hardware store. And now it's you can't even imagine a Lowe's or Home Depot without a garden center. And it's a lot of times the innovation comes out of, I think, this other models where we have differentiated in terms of shared ownership and shared risk. Yeah.
And also greater input.
Right.
right? I mean, from that democratic model where you're actually listening to members and you're getting more inputs from more directions, different points of view, different lived life experiences, right? You're able to kind of innovate in a way that might resonate a lot more than having controlled decision making from a
Right.
small group of people that are maybe don't have the same lived experiences as the folks who are living around that store, and they don't understand their needs as well as the employees who work there. Right? I mean, I can't remember what that principle is, but there is that thinking around, you want opinions from folks that are closest to the work. So if you want to
Subsidiarity.
understand, yeah, like you want to understand like how to improve our manufacturing process, well, ask the people on the floor, what's working, what's not working, versus, having that in a boardroom where people have never actually have any experience of what that actual practice looks like today.
Right. Exactly. Oh, I did grab some of the figures around just how deep of a haircut this really was, which I thought you might also find really interesting. So from the court filings, they found that at the time of the initial bankruptcy filing, True Value owed approximately $238 million to its secured creditors.
Shit. Okay,
PNC,
that was like basically purchase price.
right. So PNC Bank, Bank of America, Bank of Montreal, First Citizens Bank and Trust, Huntington National Bank, Citizens Bank, and Webster Business Credit filed the objection to the court in response to the Chapter 11, believing that they would not be maximizing their value. It was revealed that True Value owed more than $238 when it filed for bankruptcy, including $219 million in revolving loans and $18.75 million in outstanding term loans.
Wow.
And the deal would cause them, ultimately, their creditors, a loss of over $100 million after expenses were realized.
Oh, wow. Wow. And I do have figures on how much it was Acon, right? The private equity for how much did they make over the 6 years that they owned it?
I was very interested in that piece of it too, because I was like, oh, what, how much did they get anything out of it? Because it's just like, the 70-30 split, right?
Right.
So they did, in fact, and it was 1.15, I want to say. Yes. So during its final 3 months before declaring bankruptcy, True Value paid vendors, landlords, and service providers $183 million to keep trucks rolling and products on shelves. Roughly 30 of those businesses got over $1 million apiece. And Acon, a unit of the private equity fund that holds a majority stake in True Value, has been paid $1.15 million over the 12-month period ending October 14th. And this was modest relative to the scale of True Value's distress, but it's still meaningful because it went to the equity sponsor. And let's not forget who got $0 out of this. Those members.
Right.
The 30% members, yeah.
Well, and not to forget as well, the limited partners for private equity are largely pension funds.
Right.
Right. Like, this is money from real people, firefighters, school teachers. This is their retirement funds that they've been paying into their whole lives.
Yeah.
This sounds like this was a loser overall on the investment. The fees, Acon still made fees, right? Every year they were managing the fund, 2% of whatever the fund numbers were. So they still profited in the sense they were still getting paid regardless of what was happening with the company. The investment turned sour. Certainly, this was not an outcome that anybody wanted, including the private equity firm. But there's a lot of losers here, and the losers are the everyday people, right? I still think it's worthwhile to say at this moment that the median amount held in U.S. retirement accounts is 0.
Right.
So the folks who are most vulnerable continue to bear the biggest expense of this failed quote unquote experiment that True Value pursued with the best intentions. I'm sure, like, no judgment on the folks who made that decision. They thought it certainly was the best for them. But that does really disappointing outcome for all the folks who really were in the least privileged position to have that kind of outcome.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I found one article that just put it very bluntly and just kind of named them bullet by bullet of winners and losers in this transaction.
Oh, shit.
So in their list, losers included True Value's vendors, the creditors, and the dealer customers, so the member owners who had that 30% stake. They were mixed on employees. They said winner loser, so both were the employees because it wasn't a wholesale, layoff situation. There were about 2,000 employees at filing. About 1,300 of them were split between the 12 distribution centers, and only 2 of those distribution centers were closed as a part of the Chapter 11 proceedings.
Okay. Because they had to sell it for assets, or they just couldn't maintain it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. But many of them did end up actually being hired by Do It Best. So many of them were actually at least able to keep their jobs in this process.
Okay.
Now, on the flip side, the winners. So Do It Best, notably, paying 130 million roughly to acquire these assets, which they saw representing 1.5 billion in buying power in this transaction.
Jesus.
Pretty decent trade-off.
Margin.
Yeah.
Wow.
The rest of the sort of this purchasing hardware cooperative movement, many of them actually enticed and brought in members of True Value. So Orgill, which is one of the others in this space, they converted 400 of the True Values.
Shit.
800 stores, 8 Ace Hardware as well. 918 of the True Value stores converted to Do It Best as a part of all of this transition.
Okay.
And then also, so I would say also insiders. So there's folks who were winners who were also kind of, in that space of like you were saying, like they were the lawyers, the advisors, they were able to make fees on these transactions, right? So
totally, they got paid.
Yeah. And then I wanted to save the maybe for me the biggest winner for last, which I consider the cooperative movement, which is that like we've always already been hinting at here, right? Is that like I see such an enormous learning and opportunity for the cooperative movement. That like we were saying, like those who were sipping tea, like we learned so much. We've learned about these capital markets in ways that like to be on the outside of, you just don't understand it the same way.
Sure.
And that like we are in this space and the market is changing, and we are still sort of found at times on our back heels, like reacting to this environment and this market, with the big boxes and with e-commerce and all these others folks, and with capital flying and short-term thinking dominating the day in many ways. But to have like, to me, what is ultimately like a validation of like long-termism, decentralized risk and decentralized benefit, that the cooperative movement once again absorbed this experiment and kind of brought it home in some sense that I would like to believe James Cotter would be proud of.
Oh wow! So you think he would, at the end of the day, be pleased? I mean, not pleased necessarily, right? I think that's kind of heavy, but proud to see, or maybe relieved to see, that the model that he fought so hard for, right, that he really hustled to put into place and to normalize, ended up being the winner. Although unfortunate the turns that the company took over the years,
right?
But again, it survived, improved, that it's a superior model. Even in the most extreme example of challenge, which I don't think a global pandemic and everything that happened with the global supply chain, like it was the perfect storm of all things, and for it to survive in that moment. And I'm sure those other companies, those cooperatives, that they didn't have the best years,
right,
but they had a good enough model to survive.
Yeah.
And they knew what to do based on how, again, I think it's so important to reflect on incentives, right? So how are the incentives? How do those incentives drive decision-making power? Who held decision-making power as well, right? And what choices they made. So they had enough to survive and to be there at the other end after this experiment unfortunately failed, to help them move forward or come back into the fold. So I do think at the end of the day, it's a harsh story. These are hard lessons.
Yeah.
But I concur with you that if we see this in a positive light, that this is maybe another example.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the Delta Fund. They just posted, and I think you're friends with Katie Boland and Brian Boland. They post a lot of great stuff. They also did this comparison between Gibson and Taylor guitars, right? So it's kind of like we need this, right? Like we need these stark examples, so and hopefully we're paying attention and we're listening to what we're seeing. We don't have to repeat them so often, but yes, I mean, if we can paint this at the end of the day a win for employee ownership, for cooperative ownership, for democratic governance, right? For incentives that are more in line with all stakeholders versus, as you talk about it, short-termism, and just the needs of capital. Okay. Like, we'll take it, right?
Take some rough medicine, or bitter medicine, I guess is the actual expression.
Yeah, and this is like kind of like evolution, right? Like we, at some point things need to die out, and I'll say too, like maybe that's the moment that we're having right now, like even on a more like meta level, is that we need to see the depths of like these choices to really uncover better alternatives, right?
Right.
Or for them to be so stark to like really draw out that binary, or at least that lesson of like, this is like diminishing returns, that this is not sustainable. Maybe we really do need to try something different, and that's where innovation, maybe these larger examples of really stark innovation and really great leadership have more opportunity to be successful.
Right. Absolutely. So well said. Yeah. And here's to it, right? In a moment where we need resiliency, like we haven't in the past, right? There'll always be a need for business resiliency and community resiliency. And I'm just so pleased to hopefully be able to offer something in this story that is useful to communities in this moment as we continue to think about exactly like you said, sort of like democratic ownership and governance, and like how much it matters and how much it's sort of almost like collapse insurance.
Yes, it's durable
in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we need each other, and we always have, and we probably always will.
Yes. Thank you so much, Matt, for that. I think that's so true. And I hope that's dominantly the lesson that we lean into as we continue to face the silver tsunami,
right?
As we've been talking about a lot, where there's so many small and medium-sized business owners that are looking or reaching retirement age. They may not be equipped to or don't have a succession plan, and that is, not to put blame on anybody. That is normal, because we don't know how to do that. Like, that's not something we've been taught as one of the purposes of the show. But we do need each other, and I do think that we have the answers. And I hope we show up for each other.
Right.
I'm so glad that it was Do It Best as the viable, successful buyer, rather than what we've seen also so often, where it's another short-termist financial engineering model, where it's another series of strips until that company is no more. So that ACE, or the True Value, has even survived in a sense through this new merger, is also a blessing, right? So there's something there as well. So, well, thank you, Matthew. You've done so well.
Thank you, Dana. It's been really an honor.
I think you could breathe a sigh of relief. You've done it, my boy. You did it. I think you've brought a lot of value. So thank you so much for volunteering to run this episode and to be a part of Ethical Exits. It's just been an honor to have you. And I am quite confident we'll see you again soon.
I'd love to be here with you again. Thank you so much, Hannah.